The next topic we would be doing is how are we going to find out overheads for individual products. We will be doing first known as absorption costing. Now, under absorption costing, we will have to understand that we'll be taking the production overheads. We'll be finding out the production overheads based on predetermined base. So we'll have to understand what is this production overheads and what is this predetermined base. So now before we go into it, let's try understanding few of the terms. How are we going to find out the overheads? Now overheads, step 1 will be to identify various cost centers. For us, the two cost centers which I am concerned about is production or service. So I need to identify the cost centers and then divide them into production or service. Second step, now step 2. Step 2, we call it as allocation. Now what is this allocation? Allocation basically means identifying expenses which are incurred specifically by each cost center, Now let me give an example. Let's say I have 4 departments. Let's say machining, finishing, and stores. So I have taken, from 4 I have just taken 3 departments: machining, finishing, and stores. Let's say there are some indirect wages which was paid only by them 10,000. He purchased some indirect material worth 20,000. Finishing department incurred indirect wages of 5,000, indirect material of 6,000. Stores department had indirect wages of 1,000, indirect material of 4,000. Now if you look into it, what is happening is there are expenses of indirect wages where 10,000 was incurred only by machining, 5,000 was incurred, 10,000 was incurred by machining, 5,000 by finishing, and 1,000 by stores. Indirect material 20,000 by machining, 6,000 by finishing, and 4,000 by stores. Now because of this, the expenses which are incurred, which is indirect in nature, which are incurred by the machining department, you will charge only to them. Here finishing you will be charging. This process of charging expenses which are incurred specifically by every cost center we call it as allocation. Therefore allocation basically is all the expenses which are incurred specifically by the respective cost centers. Now then you might ask, what are the expenses which won't be in common? Now let me take an example. you have three departments where machining, finishing and stores. These are all in the same premises. These are all in the same premises. Now when they are all in the same premises, now let's say I am paying rent for this. Are you paying rent only for machining, finishing or stores, or are you paying all three put together? The answer is you are paying it for all the three put together. When all the three are put together, you are incurring a common expenses. Here we cannot allocate it to one department straight away because they are incurred together. In this case, what we do is we do the next stage, which is known as apportionment. We do the next stage known as what? Apportionment. So what is apportionment? When I have a common expense, the method of dividing common expenses to various cost centers. In this case, it was rent. I have to divide rent to machine, finishing and stores. This division of common expense on various departments, we call it as apportionment. Therefore, apportionment is basically dividing common expenses to various. Now comes the next question. How are we going to divide it? How are we going to divide it? Now there are certain common things what we do so that we understand things better. So what I'll do is I'll give you a list of items and how they are divided so that next time when you have any other question you can always start following that. First one, rent. You can make the list of the expenses. Rent, area occupied, rates and taxes. We are talking of business rates and taxes, which will be done or let's say divided based on the area. Depreciation, hi everyone, we will be doing overheads today. Now first thing, what do you mean by overheads? Now when I say overheads is basically the sum total of all the indirect material, indirect labor and indirect expenses. Now when I say overheads, why is it important? Overheads are the expenses which cannot be traced or identified with any particular cost unit. Now, when I am talking of a direct expense, when I am trying to produce a product, it's very easy to find out what is the cost of material, labor, which are all directly related to the production. Whereas when I come to overheads, it becomes very difficult to trace how much is it. For an example, let's say I am producing a particular product. Do you know how much rent has been consumed by a particular product? It becomes very difficult. Therefore, what we will be doing is we'll be trying to find out a different method on trying to allocate this overheads to a particular product. This is known as absorption of overheads, which we'll be covering it a little later. So in this chapter, we'll be trying to find out again how much indirect expenses do we attribute to particular unit of production. Now we know the total cost of a product, I need to recover both my direct cost and my indirect cost. So direct cost we call it as the prime cost and indirect cost we call it as the overheads. Now if I have to classify overheads based on the function, we divide into 4 and they are my production, selling and distribution, administration, research and development. Now what is production overheads? A production is the indirect expenses which are concerned with the physical production of a product. Selling and distribution is concerned with making sure the goods are reaching or made available to the customers. Administration is got to do with dealing with customer accounts, orders, administering the entire office expenses. Research and development is concerned with trying to come up with a new product or developing an existing product. If sometimes it becomes very difficult to classify overheads under these categories, then we try putting it across under a category of general overheads. Now there are other classifications which are not important for your exam. If the overheads are tried to classify based on the nature, we have fixed, variable and semi-variable. If it is based on the element, we have indirect material, indirect labor and indirect expenses. Controllability is overheads which can be controlled and which cannot be controlled. What are these? We have already covered in the first chapter, where we say any expenses which I can stop when I am stopping my production. For an example, let's say rent. Whether I produce or not, I need to pay rent. So rent is uncontrollable. Let's say electricity. Electricity will be incurred only when I start my production. So if there is no production, no electricity, that is controllable in nature. Clear? So this is not very important for your exam, but you need to just get an understanding of it. Next, for all our purposes, what we will be doing is, we will be classifying the cost center. I told you guys what's a cost center. Cost center is basically a place, location, activity, function where the costs are getting accumulated. For all our practical purposes in the cost overheads chapter, we will be dividing our cost into two, cost centers into two. One, production cost center. The second one is the service cost center. Now what is this production cost center? Now production cost centers are the ones which are involved with the production process, whereas a service cost center is the one which is not involved in the production process, but they provide support to the production centers. This can be maintenance department, stores department, canteen, which are all going to be required for making sure the production cost center is supported. Right? Now let us come to the overheads chapter. Now how are we going to be doing an overheads? Now first thing what we will be doing is, before I go into allocation, let me just give a brief of how it works. First thing I will be doing is, I will identify all the cost centers which are involved. For example, let's say I have machining department, finishing department, stores department and maintenance department. So my first task is to identify different departments which are involved in the factory. Now once I identify it, what I'll be doing next is I'll be identifying which of the things are going to be production, which of the cost centers are going to be service. Now in this given case, I know stores and maintenance are part of my service center, whereas machining and finishing are going to be part of the production centers. So I told you guys I'll be dividing my cost centers into two, which is my production and service. So before I start any process, again I'm repeating, I need to identify various cost centers which are involved and then try identifying which are the following are the production centers and the service centers. Now comes the next part. What is allocation? Now when I say allocation, out of the cost centers I have identified, I try finding out expenses which are directly concerned with those cost centers: machining, finishing, stores, and let's say canteen. So I need to identify expenses which are incurred only by machining, which are only incurred by finishing, only incurred by stores. Let's say for an example, I have hired a manager, and the manager I am paying 50,000 and he is going to work exclusively for the machining department. In this case, I know this manager's salary has to be attributed only to one particular cost center, that is what? Machining. So like this, we'll be identifying expenses which are incurred specifically by each cost center or which can be specifically attributed to every cost center. This is known as allocation. So I told you any direct cost. When I say direct cost for the cost center which can be traced to a particular cost center, we call it as allocation. Now see here another example. I have machining department and stores department. For that I have taken separate buildings for machining and separate building for stores. I am paying a rent of $10,000 and $5,000. This rent what I am paying is separately for machining department. This 5 what I am paying is for the stores department. So I will be charging it to that particular cost center. This is another example of allocation. So we have different examples: any salary which have been paid, any indirect material which has been incurred by a particular cost center. The next topic we would be doing is apportionment. Now what is this apportionment? Apportionment is basically when I cannot identify expenses which are to a particular cost center, I have to find out a way to split those expenses. Now apportionment is splitting the common expenses to various departments or cost centers on a reasonable basis. Now let's say for an example, I have one particular building where stores, machining, assembly, all the three are happening at the same time in the same building. That means whatever rent I am incurring, if you look into it, it is not just for one particular cost center, for all the cost centers. So I have to find out a reasonable way of dividing these expenses to different departments. This way of dividing expenses which are incurred in common to various departments is known as apportionment. Now I want you guys to look into certain examples or where we will be using this division. First, rent, rates, taxes, lighting. This will be apportioned based on the floor area. Second, labor, welfare, personal office or office administration will be divided based on the number of workers. General overheads are going to be divided based on the direct labor hours. If I don't have information about the direct labor hours, I'll be trying to use it as my direct wages. If I cannot use my direct wages, I'll be doing it based on the machine hours. The next set is depreciation, repairs and maintenance and insurance. It will be divided based on the original value of the asset, or we say capital values of the respective asset. Power is be done based on the horsepower. Now let us look into a particular example. I have indirect wages 10,000, 50,000, 40,000, 10,000, 5,000. These are what? These are the indirect expenses which are incurred by A, B, C stores and timekeeping. Now what did I say? First step is to identify which are the cost centers which are got to do with production and service. These three fall under the category of my production centers. Stores and timekeeping is going to be part of the stores and timekeeping are going to be part of my service centers. Now expenses which I know are going to be incurred by particular department, which I know I can split it across straight away without even further calculation, I told you will be known as my allocation. So first step, I'll allocate expenses. See, I know my indirect wages which are incurred by each department specifically. So first indirect wages 10,000, 50,000, 40,000, 10,000 and 5,000. Now let me come to the second expense, area occupied. Is area occupied an expense? The answer is no. Third expense is the rent. Now if I look into the rent of 1 lakh, the rent of 1 lakh is going to be divided based on the area, because I know rent for all the cost centers. I don't know anything for a particular cost center. So I know 1 lakh is spent between A, B, C stores and timekeeping. I know one of a reasonable basis of dividing my rent will be based on the area occupied. So for the first one, first how do I divide it? Let's look into this. For the A department, 1 lakh into what's the area of A department? 3,000 divided by 3. Do the sum total of the area. Do the sum total of the area. That will be 1 lakh into 3, 6, 9, 10, which will be 30,000. So rent for A will be 30,000. Now if I have to do it for B, what's the area of B? Is 2,000. So it will be 2,000 divided by 10,000 multiplied by 1 lakh. Same way for C. For D will be again for E, again it will be. So if you look into it, what is this process known as? This is known as apportionment, where I am apportioning the common expenses to various departments based on a reasonable basis. Now we have understood what is allocation and apportionment. Now let's look into the next step, which is reapportionment. What are we going to be doing in a reapportionment? When we say reapportionment, we need to understand that all the cost of the service center, should be reallocated back to the production center. So reapportionment is whatever is the cost of the service centers will be reallocated back to the production centers. How are we going to be doing it? We will be doing it based on the services availed. Based on the services availed, we shall divide the total costs which are incurred by the stores and timekeeping. These are my service department back to the production departments A, B and C. Now why do we do it? Because it's the production process which is going to be charged to the product. The cost of the service center cannot be ignored. So this will be apportioned back to the production department so that when we are charging to a product, we can recover all the product cost, that is, which is got not only with the production center but also with the service center. So I told you what is reapportionment: dividing the cost of the service department to production departments, dividing the cost of service department to the production department. Now there are three methods of doing it, but before we go into any of these three methods, let me just give an example of how it works. Let's say there are three departments A, B and C. There is a stores department. Now which is the service department here? The service department here is the stores department. Now what does the service department do? The service department stores is in charge of making sure that the goods are purchased and they're stored and make it available to the production department as and when required. So what happens is, the production department A, B and C, whenever they require goods, they will place an order with the stores department. So the stores department will work only when the production departments place order for the goods what is required. Therefore, I can say the number of the services availed will be basically the number of orders placed by each department. Now keeping this in mind, now what we'll do is we'll just take an example. Now after allocation and apportionment, I have A, B, C and stores department. After allocation and apportionment, I found out that the costs were 30,000, 40,000, let's say 30,000 and 20,000. The cost of the service department has to be given back to the production departments A, B and C. So let's say the number of orders placed was 30, 40 and 30. So the entire cost of 20,000 will be divided between A, B and C in the ratio of 30 is to 40 is to 3, that is 3, 4, 3. So that shall be 6,000, 4,000 and 6,000 respectively. Now this method of splitting the cost of the service department back to the production department, we call it as reapportionment. Now sometimes what happens out there is, let's say there are departments A, B and C, and there is a service department S1 and S2. Now S1 is giving service to A, B and C, and S2 is giving service to A, B and C. Now what will you do? You will take the cost depending on the ratio in which they have given the service. You will be dividing it between A, B and C. Then again the cost of S2 will be divided between A, B and C. Now this division of the cost between A, B and C, we do it. This is known as reapportionment. Now let's look into it. Another scenario. There are departments A, B, C, service center S1 and S2. S1 is giving service to A, B, C and S2, and S2 that is and S2 is giving service to A, B, C and S1. What is the objective of the reciprocal servicing? Is to make sure that the cost of the service centers should be allocated back to the production centers. Now in this particular scenario, if you look into it, my cost of S1 and S2 is actually getting shared again back. That is, S1 is providing service to S2, S2 is providing service to S1. Whenever this situation happens, we call it as reciprocal servicing. That is, one service department giving service to another department. In this case, where the service department provides service to each other, our objective is to make sure that these costs are finally eliminated and transferred it back to the production departments on a reasonable basis. For this, we shall be following three methods. Three methods are followed for my reciprocal servicing. The first method is known as repeated distribution method. Second method is known as simultaneous equation method, and the third method is known as trial and error method. Now let me look into it. How do we do it? So let's take an example and then try solving it. Now I want you guys to focus on this question. First step, I've identified my production and the service departments. Which are the production departments? A and B. Which are the service departments? Boiler house and pump room. Then I have to do allocation and apportionment. In the given question, they have done the allocation and apportionment, and they have said A is 3 lakhs, B is 5 lakh, C is 3 lakh, and pump room, boiler house is 3 lakh and pump room is 60,000. Now let's come to it. How are the costs of boiler house and pump room split? If you see the cost of the boiler house, which I have represented as BH, is split between A, B and C in the ratio of 60, 35 and 5%. That is, boiler house is providing its services to A, B and the pump room at 60%, 35% and 5%. And pump room is providing 10, 40 and 50%. What is happening? Pump room is providing service to boiler house is providing service to pump room. We call such services as what? Reciprocal servicing. Now in this, what we will do is we'll take this particular question and try solving under the first method called repeated distribution method. So let's start. So let me write this. I want you guys to remember this. Boiler house is giving service to the departments 60, 35, 5, pump room 10, 40, 50. So let me write this first. Now, first thing what I'll do, I can choose either boiler house or pump room and divide the cost between A, B, boiler house and pump room. Let me go back, check what is the ratio in which pump room is. Pump room is giving a 10, 40, 50. Pump room is giving services to A, B and boiler house in the ratio of 10, 40 and 50. So let's say redistribution of pump room. So I 10% to A, that will be 6,000. 40% to B, that will be 24,000, and boiler house 30,000. I've allocated all the cost of pump room, so I'll make it as minus 60. So this became 0. Now I have 3,30,000 of the boiler room. Now boiler room is divided in the ratio of 60%, 35% and 5%. So let me focus on this 3,30,000 into 60%, which will be redistribution of boiler house, that will be 1,98,000. Then the next one is, if you look into it, 35% has to be given to B, so 3,30,000 into 35%, that will be 1,15,500. Then 5% to 5% to the pump room, that will be 3,30,000 into 5%, which will come to 16,500. This now has been divided, so boiler house became 0. I have to now divide 16,500 of the pump room to again A, B and C. If you see what I am doing, first I distributed pump room to ABC, then I divided boiler house to ABC, boiler house becomes, now again I am dividing the pump room to A, B and boiler house. So since we are doing this again and again, we call this method as the repeated distribution method. So let me go further. I have pump room which is to be divided in 10, 40 and 50. Redistribution of pump room, that will be 1650. 10%, 40% will be 16,500 into 0.4, 6,600, 16,500 into 0.5, 8250. So I've split the entire So this became 0. Now I have 8250 which I have to divide, that's my boiler house, which I have to divide between A, B and the pump house in the ratio of pump room in the ratio of 60, 35 and 5. So redistribution of boiler house 8250 into 60%, that will be 4950, then 35%, 2888 and 825. Now since the numbers are going smaller, what we'll do is we'll do one more step and we can stop at it so that we can finish off, or else this will never end because it will go up to point decimal, so we can stop at the next stage. So I have now this became 0. So now I have to make sure that I'll be splitting it across finally. So what I can do is my 412 what is there of the pump room, I can just divide it in this ratio 10, 40 and 50, that is redistribution of pump room. 10 will be 41, 10%, then 412 into 40%, that will be 165. Then you have a 50%, that will be 412 into 0.5, which is, so this became 0. So now what I'll do is the last 206 what is there, I'll just divide it between, because it's the boiler room ratio, I'll divide it between A and B in the ratio of 60:35, so that I don't have to continue further. Redistribution of boiler house 20. Now let's just do the total of everything so that we know what's now. If you see, this has become 0, so both my service centers have become 0 and I have put across all my cost between A and B. So the total of A will be 3 lakh, just add up 3 lakh plus 6,000 plus 1,98,000 plus 1650 plus 4950 plus 41 plus 130, that will be 510. Under absorption and over absorption of overheads. Now what is this under absorption and over absorption? Before we go into it, let's try understanding that I told you we will be absorbing the overheads based on the budgets. I told you we'll be absorbing the overheads based on the budgets. Now if let's say I am planning to work for 10,000 machine hours and I'm expecting my overheads to be 1 lakh. Therefore, can I say my absorption rate is gonna be 10 per hour? Now you have worked this year for, let's say, 7,000 hours. You have worked this year for 7,000 hours. Therefore, can I say what you would have charged to your product will be 7,000 into 10, 70,000 hours, 70,000 rupees. Is this the actual? The answer is no, because I have budgeted that it will be 10 per hour. So if I work this month for 7,000 hours, I have recovered from the product around 70,000. Now I got my actual bill. My actual bill turned out to be, let's say, 65,000. You have actually charged from a product 70, whereas your bill came up to be 65,000. This difference, we call it as under absorption or over absorption. So when do we call it as an under absorption? This we call it as overheads absorbed, and this is my actual overheads. So if my overheads absorbed is more than the actual overheads, it's an, we call it as over absorption. Vice versa, we call it as under absorption. Now let me look into this. If my budgeted, that is my actual overheads absorbed is greater than my actual overheads, that is what I recovered is more than what it, then we call it as over. If my actual is more than the budget, budget is again the same thing, we call it as under absorption. Now again let me look into this example. Budgeted overheads is 10,000, budgeted hours is 6,000. So what is going to be my absorption rate? Absorption rate will be 12 divided by 6, that will be 2 per hour. Your actual cost is, that is what is going to be your actual bill, came up to be 11,500. You have worked for 5,000 hours. Therefore, your overheads absorbed will be equal to 5,000 into 2, 10,000 rupees. Your overheads absorbed is, sorry, is 10,000, whereas your actual overheads is 15,000, sorry, 11,500. Therefore, the difference of 1,500 I have absorbed more, we call it as over absorption. Vice versa would have been an under absorption. Thank you.